Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ifoma Ben. I'm a founding partner at the Law Suite and the founder of Legal Business Network. We are welcome to our webinar today, which is focusing on ESG for lawyers. So just before we continue, I'll just give a background. Legal Business Network is organizing this webinar in collaboration with the facilitator, Choma Ibo. And Legal Business Network is an accredited training company by the Nigerian Bar Association Institute of Continuing Legal Education. So for all those who registered for this webinar and who also joined the training, they will receive their certificates from the MBA ICLE. So this is a 4-part specialized training on ESG for lawyers, and we have 4 dates scheduled for this webinar. So today being the 17th of June, we are having the first part, and today we are going to talk about the foundations, understanding ESG and its global rise. So we want to know what exactly is ESG, how does it concern lawyers, what should we be looking out for, how do we position ourselves in this emerging area. So we also have the second session, 24th of please mute.
The sense is using just to stay away.
Please do not unmute yourself. Otherwise, I will remove the person.
Yesterday he came and said he wants to go on leave. I didn't matter because what you're doing, is it not better for you to go on leave?
So that we know that you are
exactly you're not.
We should actually learn manners on how to join online meetings. You don't join online meetings, you are not speaking and you are muted and you are in another meeting or other thing. It's not professional. So please, let's not unmute. You are not facilitating and you are not speaking. So there's no need for you to unmute because that will disrupt the meeting. So as I was saying, today is the first day, and we are going to be having the second session on the 24th of June. The third session, 15th of July, while the last session will be on 22nd of July. And each of the training attracts 1 CPD point. And once you have registered for the training, you may not need to register for the others because it's automated. So quickly, I've introduced our topic today, understanding ESG and its global rise. So I'll go ahead to introduce our facilitator. She would also tell us more before she starts the training. So our facilitator is a sustainability and climate advisory professional with 8 years of experience working at the intersection of ESG strategy, climate advisory, and legal practice. Yes, I forgot to say that Choma is a lawyer and is a lawyer called to Nigerian Bar, but she's joining us all the way from Canada. That's where she's facilitating this training from. So before transitioning into sustainability advisory, Joanne practiced law in Lagos, Nigeria. She was called to the Nigerian Bar in 2018 and brings a unique perspective that combines legal training with practical experience advising companies on emerging ESG and climate-related issues. She currently works at Share, where she advises companies on decarbonization strategy, climate governance, sustainability disclosure, and transition planning. So our experience spans sectors including aviation, energy, infrastructure, transportation, and consumer staples. She has supported organizations in developing the GHG reduction targets, strengthening climate governance structures, and advancing sustainability reporting align sustainability reporting aligned with leading global frameworks. Choma, I think you should just share the second slides where you have your profile. Just go to the second slide so that yes, people can just.
Awesome. Should I
Okay,
bring
yeah.
it up here?
It's fine, it's fine. So I will just, because I will abridge. She has a bachelor's degree from the University of, Bachelor of Laws degree from the University of Reading, United Kingdom, and a Master of Laws in International Business Law from Osgood Hall Law School, York University, Canada. So we are privileged to have Choma. She's an ESG advisory specialist. And you'll be wondering, what has this got to do with lawyers? Because sometimes, yes, if it is not litigation or if you are not in court, either dispute resolution, uh, litigation, mediation, or arbitration, you will be wondering what other things or other people will be thinking, what do lawyers even do? But you know that law cuts across every aspect of life, including in your church, in your mosque, everywhere. So because there are always legal issues in everything we do, and that is our work as lawyers, to position ourselves to have the opportunity to provide legal guidance for clients and provide solutions for them in all these areas. And to say that my perhaps my first contact with ESG, trying to think about it more deeply, was, when you talk about environmental, social governance, and you ordinarily on the face of it, you'd be wondering, how does this concern lawyers? How do lawyers come in? So I haven't really I didn't really pay particular attention to it until sometime, a couple of years ago when I attended exam conference where, the company secretary of, I think, Ayotola Jago, who company secretary, is it Oando? Yes, I think she's an authority also on ESG. She's a lawyer, an experienced one, and she's playing in that field. When she delivered a paper at that conference, I now started paying attention that, well, this is an area that lawyers should also pay attention to, because there are so many areas that are overcrowded. You can start positioning yourself on new areas before before everybody gets to know about it. You have become an authority in that area. So welcome our facilitator as she takes the stage now to tell us more about herself and go right into the session. So just as ground rules, please do not unmute. Do not unmute, and if we see that you are disturbing the session, we'll remove you because we don't want any form of distraction. So do not unmute until maybe if you're asked, you can put your questions on the chat box, and we'll all get to it at the right time. Then if you need to speak or to explain anything, then we can grant you audience if need be. So Choma, you have the floor.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Mrs. Ufoma, for the introduction. It's such a pleasure to be here today and to meet you all. I'm really interested and excited on the work that the Legal Business Network has been doing to educate lawyers across different topics. As Mrs. Ufoma discussed, hello, Joanne Ebo, or Choma Joanne Ebo. I have experience advising corporations, companies across different sectors in ESG related issues. I also have a background in law, and the purpose of this session today is really, my hope is that by the end you would understand ESG as being more than a buzzword, but rather, being able to understand in more practical steps the relevance of the industry and also the roles that lawyers have to play in contributing to ESG-related matters. So having said all of that, I'm going to kick things right off. So this is the first of 4 trainings, and the learning outcomes I'm hoping we all leave today with is number 1, understanding what ESG means. Number 2, being able to distinguish ESG from CSR and then sustainability, because these are really 3 interrelated concepts. Thirdly, I would like us to leave with a strong understanding on why ESG matters, not just regionally like in Nigeria, but also globally. And then finally, I would want us to leave with a recognition on how ESG intersects with legal and business issues. Okay, so of course we have to kick things off with having a foundational understanding of what ESG is. As Mrs. Ufoma mentioned, I'm sure many of you have come across this as a concept, but essentially it refers to the frameworks or a metric-based system that is used to evaluate how organizations are managing their environmental, social, and governance risk and opportunities. So think about it as a benchmarking of some sort. It's been increasingly used today now by investors, regulators, and other parties and stakeholders to assess corporate resilience, to assess a company's long-term performance and also accountability. And just to also like move further, as an example here. So when we talk about the environmental pillar, a good taking an analysis to evaluate, for instance, whether X company has set a credible and measurable Scope 1 to 3 emission reduction target, and whether those targets align with the goals of the Paris Agreement. As you may or may not know, and we're going to get into this in week 2 of the training, but the Paris Agreement has set a baseline for countries to decarbonize over time. The high-level objective is ensuring that the global warming does not exceed a 1.5 degrees Celsius temperature rise. So the environmental pillar will be assessing how a company, and if they've set out to develop a target to ensure reduction of their emissions over time. And then the social pillar is, for instance, will be managing labor rights and human rights risk. How is a company assessing that? Do they have a good handle on that in their direct operations as well as their indirect operations? And then finally, when we speak of the governance, it's really speaking to the board, right? As we all know, I'm sure like the board generally has oversight on a myriad of issues when it comes to the corporate structure. So it's like, how is the board appropriating the oversight of material sustainability risk and opportunities? So now that we have a good understanding of what ESG is, like a high-level understanding, I think it's also very important for us to have a clear distinction amongst these 3 interrelated topics. So there's CSR, there's sustainability, and there's ESG. And now we already know that ESG is a metric-based framework that is used by investors and regulators to measure the performance of companies across the pillars. When we talk of sustainability, think of ESG as the linked to sustainability. So with ESG, we would be able to have the necessary and relevant data points to assess the extent to which Company X, for instance, is assessing their long-term risk, their long-term opportunities, and then also how they're going to be developing, for instance, a risk assessment framework to manage said risk. So ESG is sort of the interim measure, if you may, and then sustainability is like a longer term viewpoint. And then CSR finally is, think of it as philanthropy. Take, an oil and gas company with operations in Bonny Island, for instance. There's an oil spill. X company decides to donate XYZ millions of naira to the community. That's just CSR. And you'll see CSR is just goodwill. So ESG moves beyond goodwill, moves beyond voluntary actions to more mandatory actions. And we're going to get more into that in the slides to come. Okay, I'm hoping we've all been paying attention now, and we're curious, like, how did we get here? How did ESG evolve? So I thought to include this graph because it really drives home the point on ESG being a decade year evolution. And I started with 2004 for various reasons. Like 2004 is when you would say that ESG began growing awareness. In 2004, there was also the landmark report that was issued by the UN Global Compact. And, for curious minds on this call, it's a really insightful read. It's titled Who Wins Here? And for the first time, really, there was consensus that ESG-related issues actually affect the financial performance of companies. And so investors, regulators, industry actors started contributing to the awareness around ESG as a concept. In the 2000s, this is when we would note that ESG really went mainstream. This set off the emergence of frameworks and standards such as the GRI, such as the Carbon Disclosure Project, CDP for short, such as the TCFD. And yeah, don't worry about the acronyms. We're going to get into more of that in week 2, but this really started the influx of frameworks and standards concerning reporting requirements, concerning setting different targets as well for different sectors. And then the 2010s is a very, very crucial year. The 2010s introduced, in particular 2015, introduced the Paris Agreement. And the Paris Agreement is like a global commitment entered into by many countries in the world. I believe the only exceptions are the United States, which with Trump coming into power last year, he sort of like reneged on that, but it's a really crucial framework, and it really sets up the stage for what has followed. And under this agreement, the Paris Agreement, every country in the world has submitted their climate action plan, stating the goals, the measures, the interim and long-term plans they would be taking to meeting the Paris Agreement goals. And as I mentioned a few minutes back, the goal is really to ensure that we do not go beyond a 1.5 degrees Celsius temperature rise. In the 2020s, which is, where we're currently at, ESG has become more than a voluntary measure. It's now a business imperative. Sorry. It's now a business imperative.
Choma,
Choma,
please
please
on
on
mute.
mute.
I had to mute everyone. So
Okay, I've been on mute.
no, just a few seconds ago. So you can go ahead.
Okay, awesome. Awesome. Yeah, so that's the 2020s. ESG is now a business imperative. The 2020s has seen the introduction of standards such as the IFRS, the ISSB standard, which are essentially mandatory standards and requirements addressing sustainability risk across the ES and G pillar. And then finally, now and beyond, ESG has come to stay. It's really been embedded in decision making to drive long-term value. There's been a movement from a voluntary landscape to a mandatory landscape. The only caveat here, though, is that like it's been an industry that has seen a lot of headwinds as well, like in any other industry. So whilst there's been momentum, whilst there's been movement, there's also been certain markets and jurisdictions that have sort of reneged on their commitments. In the States, for instance, there's been just an overhaul of ESG related commitments, unfortunately. But, I always say that the United States isn't the center of the world. Like if you look at markets like the EU, Canada, there's still a lot of momentum being built. So that's how we've gotten to where we're at. And so now we're going to move to the, oops, apologies. Oh no, my, apologies for that. Not sure what happened. So we're going to move to the slide on the environmental pillar now. Yeah, so the environmental pillar, really, really important pillar. It's essentially addressing key environmental issues. So I've listed out four high-level issues that tend to come up quite frequently in conversations I have with corporations. So the first is climate change and corporate emissions. So the GHG emissions stem from high emitting companies, and think of sectors like heavy emitting sectors like the oil and gas, transportation, utilities, and consumer staples. And this is where addressing climate change and addressing emissions come into play. The second, of course, is extreme weather events, which we're also familiar with, increasing flooding across Nigeria, even here in Canada, like extreme winters, extreme summers. All these attest to the fact that the climate is changing. And it then, ties back to how companies, for instance, are working towards addressing these physical risks. So for a company, for instance, that has operations close to a landmass that often goes through wildfires, like how are they managing that? How are they assessing those risks related to their assets? And then the third is agricultural and food security impacts. Again, similarly, there's rising heat waves, changing rainfall patterns, affecting food chain networks, affecting food security. And then finally, there's the air pollution and gas flaring as an environmental issue. This I thought was important to include as well, given obviously we all know like Nigeria has a major role to play in the oil and gas industry. Gas flaring remains significant to being the major cause of environmental challenges, environmental degradation across different communities in Nigeria and also here in Canada. there's been a number of regulations that have come into play to addressing this. I've listed them below, like the Section 104 of the Petroleum Industry Act, and also the Regulation 12 of the Flare Gas Regulations. However, even though these regulations are supposed to incentivize high emitting companies to reduce the extent to which the gas flare, these are only weak mechanisms, criticized as not being enough to really addressing this issue. For instance, if you look at the Section 104 of the Petroleum Industry Act, large entities are only mandated to pay about two cents per ton of emissions that they emit, and about 20 cents. So in reality, it's cheaper for an oil and gas company to continue flaring gas than meeting the requirement. So it doesn't really have any teeth. But then, yeah, it's obviously good effort to try to regulate this issue. So the social pillar is another important pillar. It's essentially how organizations impact people and communities. So an example of this would be the labor rights and freedom of association concept. So I don't know if we're familiar with this, but the International Labour Organization is like the framework that enshrines labor rights and freedom of association protections. And so any efforts to discourage unionization or collective bargaining in companies is a social issue. An example would be like strikes across different sectors, with university lecturers, also public sector workers, issues around wages, working conditions, etc. Another example under the social pillar would be DEI. I think it's more so relevant, I believe, in the West, but but then unfortunately on the flip side, there's been a lot of DEI rollbacks actually in the States. But essentially it's all about gender equality in leadership positions in the boardrooms, and assessing how and to what extent the board has oversight on these issues. Thirdly, is also human rights and supply chain due diligence, for companies that have just complex webs of supply chain networks. Human rights and supply chain due diligence is an important metric for companies to ensure that conducting, for instance, third-party assessments to identify hotspots in their supply chain networks that raise concerns around child labor, for instance, around unfair working conditions. So that's what we talk about when we think of the human rights and supply chain due diligence topic. And then finally, community relations and social license to operate. Yeah, communities, conflicts linked to oil and gas, like communities around oil and gas operations come up a lot, which I'm sure we've probably heard about. Also over here in Canada, those issues mostly emerge from indigenous represented communities, like for instance, a pipeline passing through those communities and the environmental degradation, pollution that results from that action. And then finally, the governance pillar. The governance pillar is essentially good corporate governance practices. So we talk about the board oversight of climate and sustainability risk, for instance. It's essentially assessing the extent to which a board has oversight and expertise as well on ESG related issues. So now companies are increasingly expected to disclose and also ensure that their boards have access to climate and sustainability expertise ensure that the board has oversight on material ESG issues. And I give an example there, like there's been a number of cases that have emerged from um, organizations like Client Earth, for instance, which essentially filed a lawsuit against Shell, basically stating that the board wasn't clearly showing strong oversight on climate-related issues and the impacts on that from Shell's operations. Although this case was dismissed by the Supreme Court, this was a case instituted in the UK. It also raises a signal, to companies and to boards as well. Secondly, we've talked about financial reporting, ethics, and transparency. Also really, really crucial. An example I've given here is the Cadbury Nigeria accounting scandal, which we may or may not be aware of, but it was a pretty big scandal that involved financial misstatements. And it wasn't until the Cadbury UK branch conducted an investigation, which then found out that over the course of, I believe, 3 years, the company was just disclosing falsified financial statements to make it seem like the company was in good standing. So this is just an example of corporate governance being eroded. Thirdly is shareholder primacy and stakeholder theory. Traditionally, corporate governance frameworks discuss both the shareholder primacy model and the stakeholder theory model. Think of the shareholder primacy model as the conventional perspective on what corporations are for. So it basically states that corporations are just made to create profits, but then the stakeholder theory goes beyond that. It says, yes, they're made to create profits, but they also have the responsibility to ensure that in their operations, they are considering also the interest of shareholders, employees, communities, and the environment. Then fourthly, shareholder rights and corporate accountability. Increasingly, corporate governance frameworks now protect shareholder rights. So for instance, in my current role at my company, like my day-to-day involves engaging with Canada's highest emitting companies, engaging with the management and board of these companies, because my company represents institutional investors, and these investors have enshrined shareholder rights to be able to engage their portfolio companies on ES and G issues. And then finally, governance and ESG integration in Nigeria. I would say ESG governance in Nigeria is still evolving. And I say that because in the course of preparing for this, I didn't come across a lot of ESG related proposals that have been filed by shareholders on relevant companies. But if you juxtapose that with what's happening in Canada, in the States, in the EU, it's pretty common now. So giving shareholders the right to, file a proposal addressed to the management of the company to address certain ES and G issues. So that was a lot. I hope we're all still following. So that's basically breaking down what the E, what and G when you hear the term ESG. And moving on now to why ESG matters. Very, very important. ESG matters for a myriad of reasons. The first is investor pressure. So if you think back to the graph I showed on the evolution of ESG, from 2004 to now, there's just been an increasing interest and pressure from investors around assessing ESG performance in their portfolios. So, and think of ESG also as non-financial risk, right? Because like I mentioned, corporations were just built to make profits, but investors now want to not only see that their companies invested in are generating profits, but also that they're addressing ESG related risk. And there's just like insane amount of investor pressure that companies are facing now. And another element to that as well is also the emergence of various coalitions and investor networks that now engage with high emitting companies across sectors like, the oil and gas, utilities, aviation. So shareholders have increasingly understood the relevance of having many hands on deck. So, there's different shareholders that engage companies on these issues annually and actually disclose benchmark frameworks to assess the performance across different indicators under the ESG pillars. So yeah, there's just an insane amount of investor pressure now on companies. There's also the access to capital as a huge lever. So banks, investors, and lenders increasingly are not just considering bottom lines or financial performance, they're also analyzing the ESG performance on when allocating capital. And yeah, so it's kind of hard to run away from implementing ESG now, especially if you're, a corporation that requires lending, that requires loans. All of these now require, or most of them require, these companies to also consider ESG into their frameworks. And yeah, so a strong ESG performance can actually improve access to financing, but if you have a poor performance, then you may risk not being able to participate in that. And then climate risk, also very important. I touched on the environmental, the E in the environmental pillar. We talk about like physical risk. So that's just more prevalent now. Think of flooding, extreme weather events, heat waves, sea level rises, and how companies are assessing those risks as it relates to their financial performance. And then transition risk is it's usually split between among legal reputation risk, systemic risk, regulation risk. And it's essentially asking how a company is managing those transition risks. For instance, for the transportation sector, there's been an increased change in consumer demand. So consumers are now from ICE. So ICE is internal combustion engines to electric vehicles. And so there's a bit of a shift in consumer demand. So like how is a company that, for instance, specializes in just ICE operated vehicles, how are they going to manage this risk? Because it means that their bottom line will be affected because lower sales in ICE would result to that. So yeah, so that's what we're talking about when we think of transition risk. And of course, companies that fail to manage this risk or show that they are working towards managing them can face operational, financial, reputational consequences. Like an investor, for instance, could decide to file a shareholder proposal on an XYZ company because they feel like the company has not been able to demonstrate that they're assessing and managing a specific transition risk. And then finally, stakeholder expectations. Yeah, just like the affected parties, communities, customers, civil society now increasingly expect companies to operate responsibly and transparently. And yeah, organizations are just under so much hate now because they're not just being judged on what they produce or benchmarks that they're hitting, but also how their operations are impacting at large. That's really what we think of when we discuss double materiality, for instance. It's not just financial risk, The second materiality is also thinking of how your operations are affecting the community at large, how they're impacting this society. So how are ESG issues being addressed? So I feel like I've sort of touched on this a little, but just bottom line here is that, as you can probably tell from this graph, it does require an interplay across different actors. So on the one side, there's the regulatory and policy action, which is really regulations. And this is where, of course, lawyers come into play, developing mandatory requirements, sustainability disclosure requirements, carbon pricing, labor and human rights protections. I've already run through examples from the Nigeria Climate Change Act, the Petroleum Industry Act regarding flaring. The second is the corporate action and risk management actor. So this is essentially what companies and issuers are to do to also manage their ESG risk. That can look like a company, a high emitting company setting GHG emission reduction targets across material issues, like across their direct operations, indirect operations, ensuring that they have like a good and transparent corporate governance structure in place that demonstrates to investors that the board has oversight on ESG issues, for instance. It could mean them conducting a third-party risk assessment to ensure that there's good supply chain due diligence across their web of networks. And so yeah, so this is also a very crucial piece as well in this whole framework, and companies have a very pivotal role to play. And then the third is standards, framework, and disclosures. So there's just been an array of standards, frameworks, and disclosures that have come into play in the past years and are still coming into play. There's the ISSB, IFRS S1 and S2, which are essentially just sustainability disclosure requirements. S1 is sort of more general, and S2 is more climate specific. And then there's the SASB standards, TCFD recommendations. Don't worry, we're going to get into this in week 2, but these are all just frameworks and standards. And the hope is that over time, all of these converge and not diverge, because as in this work, like I mentioned, I often speak with executives, board management of these companies, and what I hear from them is like the burdensome requirements and how different framework standards are asking for different things. So now there's a push from the industry to harmonize all of these standards to drive consistency and transparency. The fourth is investor and stakeholder engagements. Like I mentioned as well, a few slides back, there is now like a ton of investor engagement under coalition investor networks. So investors are increasingly engaging companies in their portfolio across ESG issues. Like I mentioned, that can look like filing a shareholder proposal on XYZ issue. That also looks like good proxy voting practices. So like how are asset managers voting for ESG related proposals, right? And then there's also, we see like stewardship initiatives, already touched on that, community engagement, advocacy campaigns. There's been campaigns, for instance, in Canada and the States against the election of boards of directors from companies that have been flagged to just stalling on addressing ESG issues. And then finally, there's the market and financial mechanisms. So yeah, think of economic incentives to really operationalize ESG, green bonds, sustainability-linked bonds and loan, carbon market and pricing. Green bond is really a bond that has to go into a green proceed. And so when an issuer borrows that money from a government or an investor, they have to ensure that that money also goes into green proceeds, and the sustainability-linked bonds, similar to green bonds, but interest rates actually rise up or fall depending on whether companies meet certain GHG emission reduction targets, for instance, and like other climate commitments. And then, yeah, carbon pricing is, think of it as a fee for companies to emit carbon. So many markets now have introduced systems, like, for instance, the EU has introduced the emission trading system. So basically, if XYZ company wants to emit beyond the benchmark for minimum emissions disclosure, they have to actually pay to emit more than that specific ton of emissions. So over time, this is supposed to incentivize companies to address their emissions, because now it's just expensive to emit, GHG, like carbon emissions, methane emissions. So yeah, so those are how the issues are being addressed. It really requires like a multi-stakeholder approach, like you've seen, among the government, investors, regulators, markets at large. Okay, so I know that was a lot for everyone to take in, but I hope that you leave here with these key takeaways. So ESG has clearly evolved. I mean, you saw the graph, from 2004 to where we're at now.
Sorry, Shoma.
Yeah. Hello?
Yes, I'm seeing. I was looking at the charts, and I
Oh,
was
okay.
wondering. Yes, I saw where. So I don't know whether it's a message that just came now or it was there earlier, saying you are muted. So I don't know whether it was before, because I can hear you clearly, and I just want to also ask for comments on the platform. Please, if you at any point you cannot hear our facilitator or hear me, please put it on the platform here. And I believe I can hear you clearly, Choma. So if there is
Okay.
anyone, okay,
Yeah, sorry.
okay, I think the person had the personal. Okay, please go ahead. So let's just go ahead and summarize, because I have some questions here, and I
Yeah.
know some people might also have some questions. I know it's a bit technical for some people. We just, talking about emission, carbon, and all that, green, yeah, green bonds and all that. So it's not the day-to-day language that some of us are familiar with, unless maybe you play in the oil and gas sector and you have been involved in ESG related matters. So, so I think you should, yes, continue and summarize. Then we can now take the questions. I also have some personal questions as it relates to, particularly to lawyers in Nigeria.
Okay, awesome. Okay, so the key takeaways. Yeah, so ESG has evolved from a voluntary corporate initiative into a mainstream investment and risk management consideration. I've touched on how there's currently been steps to harmonize standards. There's currently requirements across the board relating to, for instance, carbon emissions, carbon risk. There's also like a push from investors as well. So yeah, it's no longer just a nice to have. And this is also where it's distinguished from CSR. Like CSR is just goodwill, a goodwill measure, but ESG is increasingly being mandated. So that's the very, very first takeaway, super important. And then the second is regulation. Like I've mentioned, regulation is going to be a major driver of ESG adoption. Creating new legal compliance, disclosure obligations. I actually know, like in the course of this research, I know Nigeria, for instance, like the Financial Reporting Council has recently announced that for public interest entities, they're going to be mandated to disclose their sustainability related 2028. And so, yeah, like different markets are moving at their own pace, but it's really interesting to see onto the Nigerian market. The third is investor regulators, employees, customers, and communities are increasingly influencing corporate behavior and decision making. Yeah, I already touched on this. Really, investors play a key role, regulators play a key role. It's really a combination of efforts and industry actors pushing for this, influencing corporate behavior, because what we're doing here is really trying to disrupt business as usual practices. You know, where we're trying to make companies not just focus on financial risk, but non-financial risk, which is kind of what ESG is. And even at that, ESG has also been shown to contribute to the bottom line. Like if you don't manage all of these risks, there's a potential that your bottom line will be affected. So there's that. And then there's also, fourthly, climate change, human rights, labor practices, and governance issues increasingly being viewed as business and financial risks. Yeah, so I just touched on this. So yeah, ESG actually has financial risk. And yeah, that could also come as litigation. Like I mentioned the case with Client Earth versus Shell. There's also been a quite a handful of climate litigation cases across different markets as well. That is a risk. That's a financial risk, right? If companies lose to those lawsuits. And then finally, there's again just the maturity. You know, like I mentioned, I think different markets are at different paces. Things have really picked up in Western markets, like in Canada, for instance, the EU. Obviously, I mentioned the States. The States is just a complete, totally different thing going on there. Like there's just been a ton of washing down. There's been a push to stall on certain disclosure requirements that were supposed to be mandated. So a lot is happening there, but that's just one headwind we're having to deal with. And I would say the industry is also going through like a restructuring. And so the hope is that like after restructuring, there's like a more like more cohesion and understanding, more harmonized, just more harmonization on what ESG should be and how it should be operationalized into companies' practices. So yeah, so in Africa, like it's definitely Africa, Nigeria, expectations are growing, regulations are growing. Like I mentioned, the requirements announced by the Financial Reporting Council of Nigeria. So yeah, so all to end things off, ESG is not just about doing good. That's what CSR is. It's really about building resilient businesses, managing risk, and also creating like long-term value for companies across different sectors. So that's where I'm going to end things. And yeah, open to answering questions, comments, pushbacks.
Thank you very much. Let's so show some love to our speaker on the chat. No, you can use different. Thank you very much. You know, I know it's quite technical for a lot of us who are not ESG practitioners like you, and I understand that some of the terms some people are just hearing it for the first time, and it's not something that is so rampant. So I understand that, you know, it might not be. We've had a lot to chew actually. So, and therefore, I know some people are asking for either the slides or something. So we have this being recorded on YouTube. So later on, we'll also share the YouTube you know, recording. So I have some key questions for you, which I've posted on the on the chat, but I'll just read out. Um, I know you've just given a background about ESG, and because we are lawyers, we're not just general ESG practitioners. So I want you now to more like specifically talk about how does that affect us as lawyers? What are the opportunities, that we should look out for? How do we position ourselves in this emerging area? Because like I said, I know, as I said earlier on, in everything we do, there are always legal issues, but how do we prepare and ensure that, we can tap into the opportunity of this emerging area? So one of the questions says, many Nigerian lawyers are familiar with corporate governance, of course, in corporate law and all that, for those who sit on the board and who are, in practice in various organizations. We know a lot about corporate governance and, regulatory compliance. We are at home with that. So, but ESG is still relatively new. Please, May, mute yourself. You don't have to mute, please. Otherwise, would mute yourself. Okay. So I was saying that ESG is relatively new to many practitioners. So what specific opportunities does ESG create for lawyers, both in private practice and in-house roles? So that's my first question. So after that, I can take the second question. And also to say that I'm looking into the chat box to see questions or from participants. So if you have questions or concerns, please put them in the chat box. I'm still looking into the chat box for that. So while she addresses the two key questions I've put across. Yes, Joanna.
Yes, thanks, Mrs. Ufoma, for that question. So the first is, what specific opportunities does ESG create for lawyers, both in private and in-house roles? So there's different angles to answer this. So
people cannot just keep to instructions.
So because the market is quickly shifting, and because, like I mentioned in the presentation, there's a lot of demand and pressure from investors. This then trickles down to companies wanting to ensure that they meet incoming requirements. And so, like, I remember like practicing as a lawyer in Lagos. That was my first time really being exposed to ESG. Like, I was serving as the solicitor to the trustee of like a green bond transaction. Like, that's where a lawyer can come into play. Like I mentioned, a green bond transaction is essentially a company borrowing money, but when they borrow that money, they're also saying that this money is going to go into green proceeds. So as a lawyer, it will be important to have, in that context, a good understanding and knowledge of the different requirements, the different practices that the companies would have to meet. There's issues around greenwashing. Again, this is where lawyers come into play, because if a company takes up a green bond transaction and reports and assessments show that no green proceeds were realized, this could present a greenwashing risk, and ultimately that could then result to
Can you clarify? When you use when you use certain terms, you just probably take it for granted that we all know. So maybe as you are just talking about, you can just clarify some terms when you talk about green bonds, greenwashing risk, and all that. What are those?
Yes, so greenwashing is when XYZ company has committed to, for instance, reduce emissions and meet net zero commitments. So like XYZ company commits to reduce 5 million tons of their emissions by target year of 2030. So if the company discloses that, but does not also accompany that with interim climate action plans to meeting those targets, then an investor can file a claim. Like in some markets, for instance, in Canada, there's this regulation called Bill C-59. So an investor or interested party can bring a suit against this company stating that they are falsifying their statements and climate commitments. So greenwashing, think of it as a company lying to make it seem like they're meeting certain GHG related targets, but in reality and in practical terms, they are not. So yeah, it's a major issue, and it's something that comes up quite a lot in this space, which is why companies are usually encouraged to be transparent. Like this is where transparent disclosures comes into place. Investors are not asking you to just make a commitment to hit your net zero target. If you feel like you're not there yet, it's okay. But then on the flip side, disclose how you're gonna get there. So yeah, so that's what greenwashing is. And then what was the other thing? You said green bonds. Yeah, like so green bonds would be a company borrowing money to, meeting a certain investment goal, but the company that lends the money to would also have a requirement for this company to also ensure that a part of that investment goes into green proceeds and green investments. And it's one of the way the market uses, such mechanisms to incentivize sustainability investments. So yeah, so
Yes, so now back, I know we are talking about opportunities for lawyers. So I
yes,
just took you back a bit to clarify certain terms that you use while explaining the opportunity. So you can touch more on the opportunities for Nigerian lawyers.
yeah,
This is
so
my
the opportunities for Nigerian lawyers, I would say they're still emerging. And we're actually going to get into this in, I believe, week 3 or 4 of the presentation. But regulations, as you probably know now, just play a crucial role. And so that's where lawyers in public um, public services like come into play. Like I mentioned, there's a lot of drive now to mandate and harmonize standards. I mentioned the recent announcement by the Financial Reporting Council of Nigeria mandating sustainability disclosure and requirements, starting with public interested entities. And so you come into play because companies are gonna start reaching out to lawyers in private and public spaces to ensure they not only meet these requirements, but they also understand how to identify material risk. As I mentioned as well, like one of the pushbacks I get often, for instance, from clients in North America is like the burdensome nature of ESG. And then I've also like heard that in with some of the folks I've spoken to in Nigeria. But it's all about materiality, and that's where a lawyer can come into place. Like for an oil and gas company, for instance, I'm hoping we've left this call with understanding that E is really crucial. Like the E in the ESG pillar is really crucial. So for such companies in
that's
sectors,
the environmental.
yes, the environmental,
Yes, the environmental
yes.
peculiar to them, the oil and gas.
Yes, it's very peculiar. So, lawyers that have like clients and have portfolios that involve those companies, as the years go by, like I think there's going to be more movements, more interest, more conversations being had around ensuring that companies are doing what they need to do now to meeting those sustainability sustainability related disclosure and requirements. So I think lawyers would have to understand how to assess material risk so that in advising your clients, you're able to identify how to focus on XYZ issue before the next, and also provide relief from some of these companies to ensure they are meeting the requirements as it relates to their own sector. So yeah, I think understanding like risk management, understanding the materiality of ESG issues is going to be a crucial skill to have as mandatory requirements starts in Nigeria. So yeah,
Okay,
that's
okay. I
how.
think we have more questions, so that we can just take with this session will end not later than 4:30. So we just have to touch on the other questions. So essentially, are talking about there, a lot of opportunities in this area, and for you to advise clients on issues, you must first of all have a good understanding of the issues before you advise, because you cannot give what you don't have, obviously. So we'll go to the second question that I asked. And before then, I also want to recognize, I know Madam Fumi Roberts is here. She's one of those I respect, a senior lawyer who is also has been mentoring people and who is also, despite all the knowledge that she has, she still wants to learn more. So, and she has some questions here too. So I would just want you to touch on the second question that I asked, then you will now address her own questions. So the second question I asked is, what are the key factors driving the global adoption of ESG, and why should Nigerian businesses and their legal advisors pay attention? So even where ESG compliance is not yet legally mandatory in Nigeria, I know that we always play catch up most times. We always, things get going there, and before it now comes to us. So we're always playing catch up in most things. So now it's mandatory in ESG requirements, and compliance is mandatory in certain jurisdictions, but in Nigeria it's not yet compulsory. So, but how do we, looking at the second question, so what should we look out for? What should we pay attention to? Both businesses and, the lawyers and the businesses with advice. So what should they look out for? So even though it's not legally mandatory in Nigeria, but as this global adoption now grows, so what should we pay attention to?
Yeah, so the first part is, what are the key factors driving the rapid adoption of ESG? Yeah, I would say investor. There's just an immense level of investor pressure now across different markets for pushing for the adoption of ESG in issuers. There's also been an increased level of physical risk. Think of forest wildfires that has been more prevalent, for instance, here in Canada. There's also been issues around the livelihood of communities being affected, especially communities that live close to oil and gas operations, close to like high emitting factories. So all of these, like the industry, the investors, affected communities, affected parties, are all driving the adoption of ESG. There's also a strong move as well in markets. So when it comes to assessing capital, many investors and regulators are also not just analyzing companies in line with related financial risk, but they're also looking at whether said company has also managed their ESG risk, because this risk would ultimately affect the company's long-term profits. So all of these actors, it's like a multi-stakeholder action going on, and that's really what is driving this. But if I was to choose like what the most relevant actor is, I would say like investors play a crucial role because it just brings credibility. An investor saying and inquiring about a company that they have major stakeholders in. Like companies were also made to address the issues of shareholders, to manage stakeholders, as well as stakeholder concerns. So it just gives credibility to the ESG movement. So yeah, so that's the answer to that. And then why should Nigerian businesses and their legal advisors pay attention? They should pay attention because ESG is evolving, and I know the Nigerian context is different. I know there's conversations around, for instance, like pushbacks, because if you look at it, the Western countries have been able to industrialize. We're relying on oil and gas, we're relying on fossil fuel investments. But then now it seems like when Africa or when like Nigeria is still doing that is an issue. So they've been able to profit from that. And then now they're now turning their eyes to the African market. But I would say for Nigerian businesses, the informal sector is super important. So think of like the farmer in, I don't know, Zamfara State, like as climate events happen more frequently, there's risk around supply chains. There's risk that would tie back to companies achieving their goals and meeting their financial targets. So this is where the value chain comes into play, and this is where I think it will be relevant to Nigerian businesses. It's not just going to focus on your direct operations, but also your operations that you do not have oversight on, which we call indirect operations, or another terminology would be like scope 3 emissions. Those are emissions that you're not like you're farther removed from, but actually affect you meeting your targets. And yeah, Nigeria has like an informal business sector. I think it's important as well because ESG standards also provide relief for different level of companies depending on the size. So it's about working towards aligning how you're gonna be meeting these incoming requirements now against when they come into play. Like I mentioned, like the ISSB adoption is gonna kickstart in 2028 for public interested entities, and then it's gonna trickle down to other like smaller industry actors. So right now, advisors should be paying attention to the direction of travel there, because it's coming, but how are you aligning your disclosures? How are you managing your risk? How are you assessing those opportunities as well in your company mandates? So I think, yeah, Nigeria businesses play a role because it's characterized by the informal sector. It's characterized by like the value chain, and over time, these requirements are gonna come into play for those informal sectors as well, and of course, providing relief as well.
Yes, I think we just want to manage time. I know you you may want to explain further, but I will have a couple of questions more. Favor, I don't know if you can put your question on the chat, or is it a comment that you have? But let's take the two questions from 2 or 3 questions from Mrs. Fumi Roberts. She talked about, you may just look into the charts as I'm trying to read. I said 5 years from now, what ESG issue would be putting law firms in courts most often? And we are not seeing it yet. Then how do you advise clients when ESG goals conflict?
Okay.
So you might have different goals, you might have different ESG goals. Maybe you just start with the first one, then we can take the second and the last one. So the second one says, how do you advise clients when ESG goals conflict? For example, closing an oil well emitting gas is good for E, that is the environmental part. Then, but bad for S, that's sustainability when it comes to jobs. So in what situations, in such situations, who wins? So how do we balance the interest between E, S, and G, part
Yeah.
of the ESG principle? So then the third one talks about, is Africa, with many economies still developing, actually ready for wholesale adoption of ESG? Can we afford to go the route of Canada, UK, and all that? I know you've been giving us examples from US, from UK, from Canada. So where we are right now, are we ready? So you can maybe marry all the questions together when you're answering, or we just pick them one after the other. So, but we just have um 4 minutes so that we can round
Yeah.
up. We don't want to exceed 4:30. So
Okay, cool.
all
Okay.
questions and answers by 4:25, then closing remarks.
Okay, awesome. Thanks, Rob. I'm going to start with Robert's question. So, how do I advise clients, or how would she advise clients when ES and G goals conflict? So, important to state here that, like, even in the Western market, it's been unpragmatic to advise an oil and gas company to just shut down their oil and gas assets. So the tactic is really pushing them to diversify their portfolio. So an example you've given there is around like an oil well emitting gas being good for E, but bad for, for like job security. That is true. I would say that's where balancing comes into play. And I think the distinction between framing asks here is really important. What we're advising is for companies to start investing in renewable gas, for instance, investing in the renewable transition. So no one anymore. I think that's where things started off with advising companies to shut down, like an oil and gas company to shut down, but that's just not realistic. So it's more so, how are you managing the opportunities that are emerging in the renewable energy industry? And so, yeah, I hope that gives you an idea on how to like balance the push and pull there. Um, it's all about who wins equally, and just managing those risks in terms of materiality is what I would say should be your number one tactic. The second question is around 5 years from now, what's ESG issues? So yeah, looking at where things, like the direction of travel, I see cases around issues and claims on the board. Like the board of companies really plays a crucial role in addressing and having oversight on ESG related issues. So a party could bring a claim against the board of a corporation saying that they haven't been able to demonstrate um, clear oversight on ESG issues, number one, and also how they're managing those issues. Affected communities could also bring a class action lawsuit. Like this has happened before in court. Thing is, climate litigation is very complex. So, it's not the most common, but it does happen, and it's usually around like the affected group, because it does give credibility, and also around like the board of those companies and whether or not they are assessing the ESG related risk in the companies that they manage. That's the second question. And then the final one is, yeah, I think with developing economies, it's not a one size fits all approach. I don't think Africa is ready for wholesale adoption just yet. I mean, at some point, Canada wasn't ready. And if we think back to 2020, that's when things really kicked off, to be honest, was COVID times. That's when asset managers, asset owners began raising ESG issues across their portfolios. So all of these things it's a transition. But before that transition happens, the groundwork needs to also happen. And examples like the ISSB adoption coming into force in 2028 in Nigeria is an example of that. And yeah, it just focuses on, for instance, public interested entities, and then it then provides relief for smaller corporations which may not have the capacity, like the financial capacity, human capacity to meeting those requirements. So no, we're not ready, but right now there's movement there to ensure that when this adoption starts, the relevant companies and sectors are ready to ensure that they meet these mandatory requirements. I hope I did well with time. Yeah.
Yes, thank you. I think yes, so thank you very much. I think the other last question there is from, say, the law student asking. So you can, I think, ask. She's an ESG enthusiast who is interested to learn more about ESG. So you can follow our social media handles. You will see our trainings, and you can also follow our YouTube channel because we'll be streaming this uh, ESG series. We have 3 more to go. By the time we have these 3 more, these 4 parts, training, you would have had some very good background knowledge regarding ESG. So this is where we'll be drawing the curtain. Someone just posted, I think employment matters, which is considered under ESG, is already putting law firms in court sufficiently. It is simply tragic that Nigeria does not value it correctly. So, well, that's a comment which is also a concern too. Like I said, we usually come late um, to the party most times. So before we get used to it or start taking it seriously, others had already gone very far. But then we are going there. It's little by little. At least this training is part of the awareness creation, and this is also part of the empowerment and part of the way of equipping ourselves to prepare for the days ahead and for the opportunities that would be available for lawyers in the legal profession. Like I said, law cuts across everything, and you can't be, there's no business without issues or without legal issues. And we are trained to provide solutions, and we have to equip ourselves. You need to understand your client's business, your client's interests, and your client's concerns, and understand what their problems are and be able to provide solutions to them. So I would say thank you. Thank you very much, all the participants, and thank you for joining. And look out for subsequent training, subsequent webinar. The next one will be on the, let me check now. Yes, on the 24th of June, which is, I think, 24th of June is next week, isn't it? Yeah. So next week, Wednesday, we'll be having another session. So stay tuned, and thank you all for joining and for your very, very active participation. And I recognize everyone. I will not have time to mention names here, but for joining and having very engaging sessions, and still having, we are 1.5 hours gone and we still have over 70% still in the call. So which shows we are very much interested in what's going on, and we want to learn more. So thank you all for joining, and see you next week, Wednesday, for another interesting session on ESG. And more importantly, I thank our facilitator, Joanne, all the way from Canada. And she's very passionate about this, about this area, and also about sharing her vast knowledge in this and experience in this sector. So thank you, Joanne, for your generosity. We are not paying a dime for this, and courtesy of her agreeing to facilitate this free of charge. Of course, she works in Canada. You know what their per hour billing is, but we have spent 1.5 hours here at no cost. So thank you, Joanne, and thank you for your interest in also contributing to capacity building in the legal profession. And thank you once again
Thank
for
you.
participating. So I remain your host, Ifoma Ben, and see you all next week. Bye for now.
Thank you so much. Bye, everyone. Thanks, Ms. Foma.